When I walked into what was supposed to be my 32nd birthday party, my name wasn't anywhere in the room. Why was every balloon celebrating my younger brother? Why was my birthday cake sitting untouched in the kitchen while everyone crowded around Ryan? And why did my grandmother quietly slip a sealed cream envelope into my hand after my mother smiled and said, "You're 32, Samantha. Ryan's future matters more than another birthday." As I reached my car, I noticed the words written on the back of the envelope. If tonight happened exactly as I feared, it's time you knew everything. If you're listening from outside the United States, I'd genuinely love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your country and your local time in the comments. And if stories about family truth and standing up for yourself speak to you, I'd be honored if you subscribed before we uncover what was really hidden inside that envelope. I didn't open the envelope until I got home. Not because I wasn't curious. I was. But after the humiliation I'd just lived through, I needed 10 quiet minutes where nobody was talking over me, correcting my feelings, or reminding me to be the bigger person. My apartment overlooked a small marina in Stamford. Normally, the lights reflecting off the water calmed me. That night, they only reminded me how exhausted I was. I dropped my purse beside the couch, kicked off my heels, and stood in the kitchen staring at the cream-colored envelope. My grandmother's handwriting covered the back. If tonight happened exactly as I feared, it's time you knew everything. I traced the letters with my thumb before finally breaking the seal. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a business card, and several neatly folded legal documents held together with a paper clip. The business card belonged to Richard Nolan, attorney at law. The documents looked like copies of estate paperwork. My hands began to shake. Grandma Eleanor had never been dramatic. She believed in facts, records, and conversations. If she had prepared something like this, it wasn't because she wanted to create family drama. It was because she'd expected it. I unfolded the letter. Dear Samantha, if you're reading this tonight, then your birthday became Ryan's celebration exactly as I believed it would. First, I'm sorry, not because I couldn't stop it tonight, because I should have stopped it years ago. I stopped reading. My eyes filled before I even realized it. Grandma had never apologized to me for anything before. She wasn't the kind of woman who used unnecessary words. If she wrote, "I'm sorry," she meant every letter. I continued. I've spent years watching a pattern that only became clearer with time. Every sacrifice somehow became yours. Every opportunity somehow became Ryan's. When Ryan struggled in college, you postponed your vacations so your parents could help him. When Ryan's first business failed, you loaned money that was never repaid. When your father needed surgery, you took unpaid leave while Ryan said he couldn't afford to miss work. Every time someone needed something, they called you first. Every time you needed something, they asked you to understand. You always did. I leaned back against the couch. Memories came so quickly they almost overlapped. The vacation I'd canceled. The loan that slowly disappeared from conversation. Christmases where my gift budget mysteriously became Ryan's emergency fund. The weekends spent driving Grandma to doctor's appointments because my parents said Ryan was too busy building his future. I had never added them together. Each incident felt small when it happened. Together they looked different. They looked intentional. I kept reading. Your parents love you. I truly believe that. But love can become distorted. Sometimes people convince themselves that the strongest child needs the least. Sometimes they keep taking because one child never complains. I've watched Patricia and Michael confuse your reliability with endless obligation. That has broken my heart. I put the letter down. Those words landed harder than the insults I'd heard earlier that evening. Ryan's future matters more than another birthday. I had heard my mother say it. But Grandma had just described something much larger than one awful dinner. It wasn't about birthdays. It was about 30 years of expectations. I picked up the legal papers. The first page wasn't a complete will. It was labeled Copy of Supplemental Estate Directive. Most of it was written in legal language that I didn't immediately understand. Certain paragraphs had been highlighted. One sentence caught my attention. This directive shall become operative only under circumstances specifically documented by the grantor and verified by legal counsel. Below it in Grandma's handwriting, she'd written one sentence. Richard will explain. The next sheet contained a timeline, not financial records, personal observations, dates, family gatherings, holiday dinners, medical appointments. Each event had short notes. March 2018. Samantha canceled work conference to care for me. Ryan declined because of ski trip. December 2019. Patricia insisted Samantha pay for family dinner because Ryan needed savings. August 2021. Michael suggested Samantha postpone buying her condo to help Ryan's business. October 2023. Samantha visited twice weekly during my recovery. Ryan visited once. I couldn't breathe for several seconds. Grandma had documented everything. Not to shame Ryan, not to attack my parents, simply to preserve what had actually happened. Facts, dates, patterns. The last page contained only a short paragraph. You are not imagining what you've felt all these years. The hardest form of manipulation is the one that convinces kind people they're selfish whenever they protect themselves. Please meet Richard. He knows everything. Love always. Grandma Eleanor. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. This is Samantha. A calm male voice responded. Ms. Richardson. Yes. My name is Richard Nolan. I looked down at the business card. I'm sorry to call so late. No, I said quietly. I was just reading your card. There was a brief silence. I imagine you've opened Eleanor's envelope. I have. Then I also imagine you're overwhelmed. I laughed softly, though nothing about the situation felt funny. That's one word for it. His voice remained measured. Your grandmother gave me very specific instructions. What instructions? She told me never to contact you unless one particular event occurred. I swallowed. What event? He answered without hesitation. She believed your parents would eventually stop pretending to celebrate you and openly replace you with Ryan. I closed my eyes. So she knew. She suspected. For how long? A very long time. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest ever since I left the party. Is this about her will? It's about much more than money. What does that mean? It means Eleanor spent years documenting behavior, not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted the truth preserved before anyone could rewrite it. I stared again at the timeline she'd created. Every page was dated. Every note was specific. No accusations, only facts. Richard continued. I'd like you to come to my office tomorrow morning. What are you going to show me? The complete file. How big is the file? Another pause. 3 binders. I almost thought I'd misheard him. 3 binders? Yes. What could possibly be inside 3 binders? His answer made every hair on my arms stand up. 30 years of records. Your grandmother believed one day you might need to understand why tonight was never just about your birthday. He wished me good night before I could ask another question. After the call ended, I looked around my quiet apartment. Only hours earlier, I'd believed the worst part of my birthday was watching my family erase me from my own celebration. Now I wasn't even sure that evening ranked among the worst things they'd done. On the coffee table, Grandma's letter lay beside the legal documents. For the first time in my life, I had written proof that maybe I hadn't been too sensitive. Maybe I hadn't been imagining anything at all. And somewhere in Richard Nolan's office, 3 binders were waiting to tell me the rest of the story. Richard Nolan's office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored brick building overlooking the courthouse in downtown Greenwich. It wasn't flashy. No marble lobby, no oversized conference rooms. Just polished hardwood floors, shelves lined with legal books that had clearly been used for years, and framed photographs of families celebrating estate settlements instead of courtroom victories. It felt like the kind of place where people came to prevent wars, not start them. His receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. "Ms. Richardson, Mr. Nolan is expecting you." I followed her down a quiet hallway into a conference room. 3 black binders sat neatly arranged on the table. Richard stood as I entered. He was probably in his early 60s, wearing a navy suit and thin reading glasses. His handshake was firm but gentle. "I'm glad you came. I almost didn't. I expected that." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, there's a lot to cover and I don't want to overwhelm you." I glanced at the binders. "I'm afraid that's already happened." A faint smile crossed his face. "Fair enough." He waited until I sat before opening the first binder. "The first thing I'd like to make clear is that none of this is about proving your parents are evil." I frowned. "I didn't come here hoping you'd tell me they were." "Good." He folded his hands. "Because people are rarely that simple." That surprised me. Most conversations about family conflicts eventually became a debate about who was good and who was bad. Richard wasn't interested in that. Instead, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. At the top was a timeline, 3 decades. Every few years, Grandma Eleanor had documented major family decisions. "You'll notice something," Richard said. I scanned the entries. Ryan's first bicycle, Ryan's private baseball coach, Ryan's out-of-state summer camp, Ryan's first business loan, Ryan's graduate school tuition. Every one of those entries included detailed notes about how the expense had been funded. Then I saw another column, mine, college scholarship, part-time job, graduate school completed while working full-time, first condo purchased without family assistance, no matching notes, no family contributions, no extraordinary celebrations, just milestones. "I don't understand," I said. Richard nodded. "Look closer." I leaned in. Under nearly every major expense related to Ryan Grandma had written the same observation in different words. Parents described this as a temporary sacrifice. Parents assured Samantha things would balance out later. Parents promised fairness in the future. The phrase changed. The pattern didn't. Richard opened the second binder. "This one contains correspondence." He handed me a folder. Emails. Printed copies. I recognized my mother's email address immediately. One message dated 6 years earlier read, "Ryan's launch has to succeed. Samantha understands these things better than he does. She'll never make us choose." Another. "Don't mention the inheritance discussion around Samantha yet. She always asks practical questions." Another. "We can explain it later. She's reasonable." I stared at the pages. None of the emails insulted me. None called me names. None said they loved Ryan more. That almost made them worse. Everything was written with complete confidence that I would continue absorbing whatever burden came next. Richard watched quietly while I read. "Do you know what struck Eleanor the most?" he asked. I shook my head. "Your parents never discussed asking you." He tapped one of the emails. They discussed informing you. I looked back down. He was right. Every conversation assumed my cooperation before I'd ever been consulted, as though my agreement wasn't necessary, because it was expected. Richard reached for another folder. This one is different. Inside were appointment logs, hospital visits, transportation schedules, home maintenance invoices, prescription pickup receipts. Every document listed who had helped Grandma. My name appeared again, and again, and again. Ryan's appeared occasionally, usually with notes like, stopped by for 20 minutes, brought flowers, left for work. Grandma had never criticized him. She simply recorded facts. Richard broke the silence. Eleanor always believed actions mattered more than promises. I never kept score. I know. Honestly, I didn't even remember half of this. She remembered. I felt a lump form in my throat. I wasn't helping because I expected anything. I know. I loved her. I know. His voice softened. She knew that too. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Richard opened the third binder. This one concerns the estate. I sat up straighter. Finally. The inheritance. He didn't start with dollar amounts. Instead, he unfolded a handwritten letter. Eleanor wrote this after meeting with your parents 18 months ago. He adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. Today, Patricia asked whether Ryan should inherit the lake house because Samantha already has a stable career. Michael agreed. Neither asked what Samantha wanted. Neither mentioned that Samantha spent the last 3 weekends repairing this property with me. When I reminded them, Patricia laughed and said, "Sam doesn't care about things like that." I don't believe that's true. I believe Samantha has simply stopped asking. Richard laid the letter down. I stared at the page. I fixed the porch. He looked up. What? The porch. I laughed quietly through tears. The roof leaked. The dock needed repairs. The furnace inspection. I remember all of it. I looked toward the window. They weren't even there. No. But they assumed I'd be fine giving it up. Yes. I finally understood something I'd struggled to explain for years. My pain had never come from not receiving expensive gifts. It came from being treated as though my contributions naturally belonged to everyone else. Richard seemed to recognize the realization crossing my face. Eleanor used a phrase often. What was it? He smiled sadly. The dependable child becomes invisible. That sentence settled heavily between us. Invisible. Not unloved. Not hated. Simply overlooked. Expected. Reliable. Permanent. As if I would always be there no matter how little I received in return. Richard closed the third binder. I need to tell you something important. I straightened. Go ahead. About 3 weeks before your birthday, Eleanor asked your parents to meet her here. They came. They did. What happened? They believed she was finally ready to revise her will. My stomach tightened. Were they disappointed? Initially, yes. He opened a sealed envelope from the binder. Eleanor had already drafted a different amendment. I leaned forward. A different one? Yes. One she refused to discuss with anyone. He placed the sealed document on the table between us. I've read it. What does it say? I'm not permitted to answer. Even now. He shook his head. Your grandmother's instructions were explicit. When can I know? When the family gathers for the formal reading of her will. I looked at the envelope, wishing I could see through thick paper. Can you tell me anything? Richard hesitated. Then he said carefully, I can tell you this. It has nothing to do with rewarding success. It has nothing to do with punishing failure. It has everything to do with character. I stared at him. He continued, and your grandmother believed character is measured over years, not moments. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since opening that cream-colored envelope, I realized this wasn't simply an inheritance dispute waiting to happen. Grandma Eleanor hadn't been documenting money. She'd been documenting choices. Thousands of small choices. Who showed up? Who sacrificed? Who demanded? Who quietly assumed someone else always would? As Richard walked me toward the elevator, he stopped before I stepped inside. One more thing. I turned. Yes. He reached into his briefcase and handed me a small folder. Take this home. I looked at the label. Meeting Notes Richardson Family Conference. The date was only 19 days old. I looked back up. Is this from the meeting my parents had with Grandma? Richard nodded once. It is. Were they trying to change her mind? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that stayed with me the entire drive home. After you read those notes, you'll understand why your grandmother decided to sign one final amendment less than an hour after they walked out of my office. I didn't open the folder in my car. Whatever was inside had already changed my grandmother's mind enough to sign one final amendment to her will. I wasn't going to skim through something that important while sitting in a parking garage with my phone buzzing every few minutes. By the time I reached my apartment, I had 6 missed calls, 4 from my mother, 1 from my father, 1 from Ryan. No voicemails, only text messages. Mom, we need to talk tonight. Dad, don't ignore your family. Ryan, Mom says Grandma gave you something. Call me. I set my phone face down. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for not answering immediately. Instead, I made coffee, sat at my dining table, and opened the folder Richard had given me. The cover page read, Confidential Meeting Summary, Attorney Richard Nolan, Participants, Eleanor Richardson, Patricia Richardson, Michael Richardson. Everything that followed had been typed by Richard during the meeting. No opinions, no dramatic language, just an objective record. Patricia Richardson stated that Ryan's company required substantial financial assistance to remain competitive. Michael Richardson stated that Samantha was financially stable and therefore required less inheritance than Ryan. Eleanor Richardson asked whether Samantha had been consulted. Patricia Richardson responded that Samantha would understand because she always puts family first. I stopped reading. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it was so familiar. They weren't asking what I wanted. They were deciding for me again. I continued. Eleanor Richardson asked whether Ryan had offered to reduce his requested share voluntarily. Michael Richardson answered that such a discussion would be unfair to Ryan while his business was growing. Eleanor Richardson asked whether Samantha had ever requested financial assistance from the family. Patricia Richardson answered no. Eleanor Richardson asked why that fact justified giving Samantha less. No response recorded. I stared at those last 4 words. No response recorded. Richard hadn't filled in silence with assumptions. He had simply documented that nobody answered, because there wasn't a reasonable answer. My phone vibrated again. Mom. This time she left a voicemail. I hesitated before pressing play. Samantha, I don't know what your grandmother told you, but don't let lawyers poison your mind. Families say things in meetings that aren't meant to be taken literally. Please call me. I listened twice. Something about it bothered me. Not what she'd said. What she hadn't. She never asked how I was. She never apologized for my birthday. She went straight to the envelope. as though she already knew exactly what Grandma had given me. I opened my laptop. Years of working as a CPA had trained me to notice patterns before conclusions. When clients believed numbers told one story, I learned to look for what repeated. Families weren't all that different. I created a blank document. Across the top, I typed one sentence. Observed pattern. Then I started listing facts. Birthday party changed without telling me. Mom immediately worried about Grandma's envelope. Dad demanded I call instead of asking if I was okay. Ryan wanted to know what Grandma gave me. Parents discussed inheritance without including me. Parents assumed I would agree before asking. Reading them together was unsettling. Individually, each incident could be explained away. Together, they described a habit, not an accident. Another text appeared. Dad Ryan's investors are watching him closely. This isn't the time to create unnecessary family conflict. I read it twice, then laughed quietly. My birthday had somehow become a threat to Ryan's investors. The logic was almost impressive. I didn't answer. Instead, I called the only person outside my family who knew me well enough to tell me when I was overreacting. Melissa Carter. She answered on the second ring. "You sound terrible," she said before I spoke. "I feel terrible." "What happened?" I started from the birthday dinner, then the envelope, then Richard, then the binders, then the meeting notes. Melissa didn't interrupt once. When I finally finished, she was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When your parents ask for something, how often do they ask Ryan first?" I thought about it. "I don't know." "Samantha." I frowned. "No." "Exactly. They usually call me. Even when it involved Ryan. Even when it benefited Ryan. Even when it cost me." Melissa sighed. "I've known you 8 years. You've canceled vacations. You've delayed buying furniture. You've lent money. You've missed conferences. You've driven across the state at midnight. And every time you explained it the same way." "What way?" "Their family." Her words settled into the silence. She wasn't criticizing me. She was describing me. "You know what worries me?" she continued. "What? You're acting like the inheritance is the biggest issue." "It isn't." "No." She paused. "The biggest issue is that you still sound surprised." That sentence stayed with me long after we hung up. Around 9 that evening, my phone rang again. "Ryan," I answered. "Hey." His voice sounded unusually cautious. "Sam, Mom says you're upset." "I am." "I get it." "No," I said calmly. "I don't think you do." He hesitated. "I didn't ask them to change your birthday." "I believe you. I swear." "I know." He seemed relieved. "But you didn't stop it either." Silence. Finally, he said, "I didn't know what to do." "You could have said it was my birthday." You could have asked them to celebrate me for 10 minutes. I didn't think." "I know." He stopped talking. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us argued. The quiet somehow hurt more. After a long pause, he asked, "Did Grandma really leave you something?" I looked at the folder on the table. "She left me answers." "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet." He laughed nervously. "Mom thinks Grandma changed the will." There it was. Not "how are you?" Not "I'm sorry about your birthday." The will. Everyone seemed to care about the same thing. Money. I answered honestly. "I haven't seen the final amendment." "So, you don't know?" "No." Another pause. Then Ryan lowered his voice. Mom and Dad are really worried. Worried about Grandma? No. About the estate. I thanked him for being honest. Then we ended the call. As I carried my coffee mug into the kitchen, an idea surfaced that hadn't occurred to me before. Richard had shown me years of family records. Grandma had documented behavior. But there was one area nobody had explained. Money. Specifically, how my parents had managed to keep financing Ryan's opportunities despite repeatedly telling me they couldn't afford to help anyone. I opened my online banking archive, then my email. I searched one word, refinance. Dozens of old messages appeared. Mortgage notices, home equity statements, bank correspondence. Most weren't relevant. Then one subject line caught my attention. Supporting documentation received. I clicked. The email was from a regional bank dated almost 5 years earlier. Attached was a summary of documents submitted during a refinancing application. One item listed among the supporting financial information made my stomach tighten. Income verification. Samantha Richardson. I frowned. That couldn't be right. I hadn't refinanced anything. I hadn't even spoken to that bank. I opened the attachment again. There it was. My name. My annual income. A notation that my financial stability strengthened the household's overall profile. Not as a borrower, not as a cosigner, but as part of the financial presentation submitted by my parents. I didn't understand exactly how it had been used, but I knew one thing immediately. I had never agreed to have my financial information included in any application. The next morning, before I called Richard, I contacted the bank. After verifying my identity, the representative reviewed the archived file. We still have the documentation, she said. Would I be able to request copies? Yes. It may take a day or two. That's fine. She paused before adding, there are several supporting documents associated with that application. Several, yes. I believe there are signed declarations, financial summaries, and correspondence submitted during the review. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I immediately picked up my phone again. Richard answered almost instantly. I was expecting your call. I think I found something. What is it? A refinancing file from 5 years ago. There was a brief silence. Then Richard asked one question. Does it involve your parents using your financial profile to strengthen an application connected to Ryan? I froze. How did you know? His answer came quietly. Because your grandmother left instructions for me to ask you about that exact loan if you ever discovered it on your own. I gripped the phone a little tighter. You already knew about the refinancing. I knew there had been one, Richard replied carefully. I didn't know whether you would ever discover it yourself. Grandma never mentioned it. No. Why? Because she wasn't certain how much you knew. I sat back in my chair. I don't understand how my financial information ended up in someone else's refinancing application. You may not have understood it at the time because nothing illegal necessarily occurred. That wasn't the answer I'd expected. So they didn't commit fraud. I'm not saying that. What are you saying? I'm saying that people often confuse unethical decisions with illegal ones. They overlap sometimes, but not always. That was exactly the kind of explanation I appreciated. As a CPA, I dealt with similar misunderstandings every tax season. Just because something was technically permissible didn't automatically make it right. Richard continued. Let's not speculate until we review the actual file. Fair. Can you come by this afternoon? I'll be there. The refinancing documents arrived faster than I expected. The bank had scanned the archived records and made them available through a secure portal. By noon, I was sitting across from Richard again. This time, the folder on the conference table wasn't one my grandmother had prepared. It belonged to the bank. Richard adjusted his glasses. "Let's go through this together." Page 1 contained the refinancing application for my parents' home. Applicants Michael Richardson, Patricia Richardson. Nothing unusual. Page 2 summarized their income. Again, nothing surprising. Then we reached the supporting documentation. A letter from the loan officer explained that the bank had evaluated the household's broader financial stability, including the expectation that adult family members living independently had historically provided voluntary financial support during emergencies. Richard pointed to the wording. "Read that paragraph again." I did. Historically provided voluntary financial support. I frowned. "That's me." "Yes." "But I wasn't a borrower." "No." "I wasn't guaranteeing the loan." "No." "I never signed anything." "No." I looked up. "So why was I included?" "Because your parents submitted documentation showing a long history of financial assistance from you." I blinked. "What kind of documentation?" Richard slid several pages toward me. Canceled checks, electronic transfers, bank receipts, vacation reimbursements, medical payments, repairs I'd paid for. None of them had been fabricated. Every transaction was real. I recognized nearly all of them. The loan officer hadn't interpreted those payments as isolated acts of kindness. They had interpreted them as evidence that my parents had reliable family support if financial difficulties arose. I leaned back slowly. "So, every time I helped," Richard finished the thought, "it strengthened your parents' financial profile." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I said, "I never imagined anyone would look at those payments that way. Most people wouldn't. And my parents, they likely understood the benefit." He chose his words carefully. "They didn't need your permission to describe financial history that actually existed." "But they never told me." "No. And they certainly never asked whether I wanted to keep creating that history." He nodded once. "That's the difference." We spent the next hour reviewing transaction after transaction. Every document reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. A $3,800 payment when Dad's roof needed emergency repairs. A $1,200 medical deductible after Mom's surgery. Nearly $8,000 I'd quietly loaned Ryan after his first software company failed. He had promised to repay me. He never did. Not because he'd refused. Because nobody ever mentioned it again. Eventually, the debt simply disappeared, like it had never existed. Richard noticed me staring at one particular transfer. "Do you remember that one?" I smiled faintly. "It was Christmas. The furnace broke. My parents said insurance wouldn't cover it. They said they'd repay me after tax season." "Did they?" I laughed quietly. "I honestly forgot I'd ever expected repayment." Richard closed the folder. "Eleanor never forgot." He opened another envelope. Inside was a yellow legal pad covered in my grandmother's handwriting. Across the top, she'd written "Patterns matter more than incidents." Richard handed it to me. This wasn't intended as evidence. What was it? Personal observations. The first page read, "One favor is generosity. Repeated favors become expectation. Expectation eventually becomes entitlement if nobody remembers to say thank you." My throat tightened. The next page contained another note. "Patricia often praises Samantha's kindness immediately before asking for something. Michael often appeals to responsibility rather than fairness. Ryan rarely requests assistance directly. He simply accepts what is arranged around him." I looked up. She analyzed all of us. Richard smiled. Very thoroughly. What about herself? He turned another page. There in Grandma's own handwriting was a paragraph that surprised me most. I waited too long. I confused keeping peace with protecting the vulnerable. Those are not the same thing. My silence unintentionally encouraged the pattern. I cannot change the past. I can only refuse to leave confusion behind after I'm gone. I wiped away a tear. Even now, Grandma wasn't blaming everyone else. She was examining her own decisions too. That sounded exactly like her. Before I left, Richard opened a locked drawer in his desk. I'd like to show you one final item. He removed a thick envelope marked Private Correspondence. These are letters and emails. Printed. By Eleanor's request. He separated 3 of them. The others aren't relevant yet. The first was from my mother. Subject Ryan's future Patricia wrote, Ryan finally has a real opportunity. Samantha's career is already established. If anyone should make another sacrifice, it's obviously the child who's capable of recovering financially. The second email came from my father. Strong families don't divide resources equally. They invest where the greatest return exists. I stared at the sentence. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded exactly like something Dad would say. Practical, confident, completely convinced he was being rational. The third email was shorter. Patricia again. Samantha doesn't care about inheritances. She values relationships more than money. I slowly lowered the page. They actually believed that. Richard nodded. I think they did. They weren't pretending. No. They convinced themselves I didn't need fairness because I loved them. I believe that's accurate. That realization hurt in a completely different way. If they'd been lying, I could have dismissed them. Instead, they had built an entire worldview around the assumption that I would never stop giving. Not because they hated me, because they'd stopped seeing my generosity as generosity. It had become part of the furniture. Always there, always available, never questioned. As I prepared to leave, Richard checked his calendar. The formal reading of Eleanor's will is in 4 days. I'll be there. So will everyone else. I'm sure. He hesitated. I should warn you. About what? Your parents contacted me yesterday. I stopped walking. They did? Yes. What did they want? They requested an advance copy of the estate documents. You said no? Of course. What happened? They weren't happy. I folded my arms. Did they know Grandma changed something? They suspected. How? Richard looked directly at me. Because after their final meeting with Eleanor, she refused to speak to them privately ever again. A chill ran through me. What changed during that meeting? He reached into the same drawer and removed a slim audio recorder sealed inside an evidence bag. There is one recording? I stared at it. Grandma recorded the meeting with everyone's knowledge. Can I listen to it? Richard slowly shook his head. Not yet. Why not? Because Eleanor gave one very specific instruction. He placed the recorder back inside the drawer and locked it. The recording is to be played only if someone challenges her final amendment after the will is read. For the first time since this journey had begun, I realized my grandmother hadn't merely anticipated conflict. She had anticipated exactly how far my parents might be willing to go to protect what they believed should belong to them. And she had prepared for that possibility long before any of us knew there would even be a fight. 4 days passed more slowly than any week I could remember. I buried myself in work. Quarter-end reports, client meetings, audit reviews. Normally, numbers had a way of quieting my mind. Not this time. Every spreadsheet reminded me of my grandmother's notebooks. Every reconciliation reminded me how carefully she'd documented 30 years of our family's decisions. By Friday morning, I had accepted one uncomfortable truth. The upcoming reading of Grandma Eleanor's will wasn't going to determine who inherited her estate. It was going to expose who we'd all been pretending to be. Richard's office wasn't large enough for everyone, so the reading was held in a private conference room at another law firm nearby. When I arrived, nearly everyone was already there. Ryan stood near the windows, nervously scrolling through his phone. He looked exhausted. My parents sat together at one end of the long table. My Aunt Denise and Uncle Harold were quietly talking with two cousins. The room immediately fell silent when I walked in. Mom smiled first. It wasn't warm, it was careful. "Samantha." I nodded politely. "Mom." "Dad." Michael stood. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk before this started. "I don't think today's the day." His expression tightened. "This family doesn't need more distance." I met his eyes. "No. It needed honesty much earlier." Before he could answer, Richard entered carrying several folders. "Good morning, everyone." The room settled. He waited until everyone had taken their seats before speaking. "As you all know, Eleanor Richardson passed peacefully 6 weeks ago." His voice remained calm and professional. "Today, I will read her last will and testament." No dramatic pauses. No theatrical speeches. Exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. He began with smaller bequests, personal jewelry, charitable donations, family photographs, specific gifts to cousins. Everything made sense. Everything reflected the woman I'd known. Then came the larger assets: the lake house, investment accounts, commercial property, retirement funds. I watched my parents carefully. Neither looked surprised. If anything, they looked increasingly confident. Richard continued reading. "The primary residence on Maple Ridge Road shall transfer to my son Michael Richardson." Dad relaxed visibly. "Subject to all conditions stated herein." Mom squeezed his hand beneath the table. The investment portfolio was divided. Several charitable organizations received significant donations. Ryan inherited a trust established years earlier. Again, nobody appeared surprised. Then Richard reached the final pages. "My remaining estate," he looked up briefly, "shall be divided equally among my direct descendants." Equal. Not mostly Ryan. Not mostly me. Equal. I blinked. Had I misunderstood everything Richard finished reading? Silence filled the room. My father leaned back in his chair. A slow smile appeared. Ryan looked relieved. Mom actually laughed softly. "See?" she whispered toward me. "I told you your grandmother was fair." Fair. The word echoed strangely in my mind. Equal. After everything I'd learned. After the binders. After the letters. This couldn't be all there was. Even Richard seemed unusually still. He closed the will. "That concludes the last will and testament signed on March 14th. Dad exhaled loudly. "Thank you, Richard." He looked toward me. "I hope this finally puts all these misunderstandings behind us." Misunderstandings. That word again. Ryan leaned closer. "I told you Mom was probably overthinking everything." I looked at him but didn't answer. Something wasn't right. Richard hadn't moved. He wasn't organizing papers. He wasn't dismissing everyone. He simply remained seated, watching, waiting. Mom noticed first. "Richard." "Yes." "Is something wrong?" "No." Then she glanced around the room. Are we finished? Richard folded his hands. Not quite. Every conversation stopped instantly. Dad frowned. What do you mean? Richard opened his briefcase. From inside, he removed a cream-colored envelope. Not identical to mine. Larger. He placed it carefully on the table. I have one additional document. Mom's smile disappeared. What document? Richard looked directly at everyone. An amendment. Nobody spoke. Dad finally broke the silence. An amendment, yes. I wasn't aware there was another amendment. Richard's expression remained unchanged. Very few people were. Mom leaned forward. When was it signed? 19 days before Eleanor's passing. Dad shook his head. That's impossible. No. It is properly executed. Ryan looked confused. I thought you just finished reading Grandma's will. I finished reading her original will. My heartbeat accelerated. Original. Richard continued. This amendment was executed according to all legal requirements. He rested one hand on the sealed envelope. It also contains detailed instructions regarding when it may be opened. Mom's voice had become noticeably sharper. And when is that? Richard looked down at the page attached to the seal, then read aloud. This amendment shall be opened only after the complete reading of my original will, and only in the presence of all primary beneficiaries. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a glass of water. It felt as though the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Dad spoke again. What exactly changes? I'm not permitted to answer until the document is officially opened. Mom forced a smile. I'm sure it's something minor. Richard didn't respond. She tried again. Probably a clarification. Still nothing. Ryan looked from my parents to Richard. You didn't know about this, Dad answered too quickly. No. Mom nodded. Of course not. For the first time that morning, I noticed something unusual. Neither of them looked surprised that an amendment existed. They looked frightened about what it might contain. There was a difference. Richard carefully broke the wax seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. He unfolded several pages. Before reading, he adjusted his glasses. I want the record to reflect that this amendment includes a personal statement written by Eleanor Richardson. My aunt whispered, a personal statement. Richard nodded. Yes. He looked around the table one last time. This statement explains why Eleanor chose to modify the distribution of her estate. Dad interrupted. Richard. His voice was tight now. I'd like to object before this goes any further. Richard looked up calmly. On what basis? I'm concerned my mother may have been influenced. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he made a brief note on the legal pad beside him. Then he looked directly at my father. Your objection has been recorded. He paused. And your mother specifically anticipated it. Every face in the room turned toward him. Richard lifted the first page. In fact, he looked directly at my father again. The very first paragraph addresses the exact concern you just raised. The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming overhead. Richard drew a slow breath, then began reading the opening sentence of Grandma Eleanor's final amendment. Richard's voice was steady. He didn't dramatize the words. He simply read them exactly as Grandma Eleanor had written them. I, Eleanor Grace Richardson, declare that I am of sound mind, acting voluntarily and under no pressure from any person. This amendment reflects my own judgment after years of careful observation, documented conversations, and legal consultation. If anyone argues that I was manipulated into writing these words, I instruct my attorney to rely on the evidence I have preserved, not on anyone's opinion. No one moved. My father slowly folded his arms. My mother stared at the pages in Richard's hands without blinking. Richard continued, "For many years, I believed fairness meant dividing my estate equally. I no longer believe that. Equality is appropriate only when people are treated with equal respect. I have witnessed a pattern within my family in which one grandchild was repeatedly expected to sacrifice opportunities, finances, celebrations, and peace for the benefit of another. This pattern did not occur once. It occurred repeatedly." Ryan looked toward me, not defensively, confused, almost frightened. Richard turned another page. "I do not write these words because I love Ryan less, nor because Samantha earned my affection through service. Love is not something that should be bought with caretaking. However, I refuse to reward a family system that quietly teaches one child to give indefinitely while teaching another that receiving is normal." Ryan lowered his eyes. I could almost see memories crossing his face. Christmas mornings, family vacation, birthdays, moments that had probably felt perfectly ordinary to him. Moments that looked very different from where I had been standing. My father finally interrupted. "This is ridiculous." Richard didn't even look up. Instead, he calmly said, "Mr. Richardson, your mother anticipated interruptions as well." Dad's jaw tightened. Richard resumed reading. "Over the past decade, I have repeatedly asked Patricia and Michael one question. When will Samantha's turn come? I have never received an answer." My mother inhaled sharply. "That isn't—" She stopped herself, because everyone in the room had just heard the sentence. Not from Richard, from Grandma. Richard reached into one of his folders. "To accompany the amendment, Eleanor instructed me to submit supporting documentation into the estate record." He handed copies to every beneficiary, including Ryan, including my parents. The first document was one I'd already seen, meeting summaries. The second contained copies of emails. The third was something new, a handwritten log, Grandma's personal notebook. Each page listed family gatherings over nearly 15 years. Beside every event she had written observations, not opinions, not accusations, simple descriptions. Thanksgiving 2012, Samantha cooked. Ryan arrived after dinner. Parents thanked Ryan for making time. Christmas 2015. Samantha purchased gifts for everyone. Parents asked Samantha to understand why Ryan's presents cost more. Mother's Day 2018, Samantha organized luncheon. Ryan forgot reservation. Patricia praised Ryan for trying. Birthday 2024, Samantha's dinner postponed because Ryan had networking event. Parents suggested celebrating Samantha later. Celebration never rescheduled. Ryan slowly turned page after page. His face changed. He wasn't angry. He looked embarrassed. Eventually, he whispered, "I don't even remember half of these." I believed him. When you're the person benefiting from a pattern, you rarely notice the pattern. My mother finally spoke. "Eleanor only saw one side." Richard calmly answered, "Actually," he opened another folder. "She intentionally documented everyone's explanations." He read directly from the notes. Patricia stated, "Ryan needs encouragement." Michael stated, "Samantha is emotionally stronger." Ryan unavailable due to business meeting. Samantha volunteered without complaint. Again, no opinions, only records. Richard placed the notebook aside. "The amendment continues." He returned to Grandma's letter. Therefore, I direct that approximately 70% of my remaining estate be transferred into the Eleanor Richardson Family Trust. The trustee shall be Samantha Richardson. The trust exists for one purpose: to ensure family assets are never again distributed according to guilt, pressure, or entitlement. A murmur spread through the room, not because of the money, because of the structure. Grandma hadn't simply left me more. She had transferred responsibility. Richard continued explaining. The trust is legally separate from Samantha's personal assets. He looked around the room. It is governed by written instructions. Ryan raised his hand slightly. Can I ask something? Of course. So, Samantha doesn't personally own everything. No. She manages it. Correct. And she has to follow Grandma's rules. Exactly. Ryan nodded slowly. That seemed to matter to him. He wasn't looking for loopholes. He genuinely wanted to understand. My father leaned forward. So what are these rules? Richard opened another document. The trust may provide financial assistance to family members only if 3 conditions are satisfied. He read each one carefully. First, the request must be submitted in writing. Second, the applicant must provide complete financial disclosure. Third, the trustee may approve assistance only if the request does not rely upon emotional pressure, family obligation, or assumed entitlement. Silence. Then Richard added, in plain English. He looked at everyone equally. No one receives money simply because they're family. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandma. Fair, clear, documented. My mother looked horrified. So, Samantha gets to decide. Richard corrected her immediately. No. Eleanor already decided. Samantha administers the process. There was an important distinction. I wasn't receiving power over my family. I was being asked to protect Grandma's principles. My Aunt Denise quietly said, honestly. Everyone looked toward her. That sounds reasonable. No one answered, because it did. Ryan slowly closed the notebook. I owe you an apology. Every head turned toward him. He looked directly at me. I thought Mom and Dad were just proud of me. I didn't speak. He continued. I never realized every opportunity I received came with an expectation that you would quietly absorb the cost. His voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry. For some moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I answered honestly. I believe you didn't see it. I didn't. But seeing it now is your responsibility. He nodded. I know. That might have been the first truly adult conversation we'd ever had. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Unfortunately, my parents weren't finished. Dad stood abruptly. This amendment is outrageous. Richard looked up calmly. On what legal basis? My mother was emotionally manipulated. By whom? Dad hesitated. By Samantha. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I remained seated. Richard didn't react. Instead, he quietly wrote another note. Then he looked at my father. Eleanor anticipated that specific allegation as well. Dad frowned. What? Richard closed the amendment. There is an additional sealed instruction. My mother's face lost what little color remained. Another one. Yes. It becomes relevant only if someone claims Samantha influenced Eleanor. Dad stared at him. And if I make that claim, Richard folded his hands. Then according to Eleanor's written instructions, I am required to introduce the audio recording of your final meeting with her into the official probate record. The room froze. I looked at my parents. for the first time in my life. Neither of them appeared confident. They looked terrified. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any argument. My father remained standing. My mother stared at Richard as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Ryan looked back and forth between them, trying to understand why they suddenly looked so shaken. Finally, my mother found her voice. "An audio recording." Richard nodded once. "Yes." "When was this recorded?" "The final private meeting between Eleanor Richardson, Patricia Richardson, and Michael Richardson." My father's expression hardened. "That conversation was confidential." "It was." Richard didn't flinch. "And everyone present consented to the recording." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. He knew Richard was telling the truth. The room remained painfully quiet. Richard continued in the same calm tone. "As I explained, the recording remains sealed, unless someone formally alleges that Samantha Richardson improperly influenced Eleanor's decisions." He looked directly at my father. "That allegation would automatically trigger its release into the probate record." Dad slowly sat back down. "I see." It wasn't an admission, but it wasn't another accusation either. Richard made another note. "For the record, no formal challenge has been made at this time." My Aunt Denise quietly cleared her throat. "I think everyone could use a few minutes." Richard nodded. "We'll take a short recess." People drifted into the hallway in small groups. Nobody seemed interested in the coffee station. Nobody discussed the weather. The atmosphere felt strangely subdued. My grandmother had accomplished something I never could. She had forced everyone to stop pretending. I stepped outside onto a small terrace overlooking the courthouse lawn. It was a cool autumn afternoon. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk below. For the first time all day, I took a full breath. "You okay?" Ryan's voice came from behind me. I turned. He looked nothing like the confident entrepreneur everyone had celebrated on my birthday. He looked like someone's younger brother, unsure, ashamed. "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded. "I don't either." We stood beside the railing without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. "I owe you more than an apology." I looked at him. "You don't owe me a speech." "I know. I owe you honesty." I waited. "When Mom and Dad told me they were helping my company," he hesitated. "They always said it was because they believed in my future." They probably did. "I never asked where some of that support came from." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't want to know." That answer hurt, but it also felt honest. "I figured." He laughed bitterly. "If you weren't complaining, everything must have been fine." I leaned against the railing. "That's exactly what Grandma wrote." He looked surprised. "What?" "She said the hardest part wasn't what everyone expected from me. It was that nobody ever stopped to ask whether I wanted to keep giving." Ryan nodded slowly. "I understand that now." I believed he was trying. Trying wasn't the same as repairing 30 years, but it mattered. After another moment, he spoke again. "My company really is struggling." I guessed. "We've got 6 months of runway left." I smiled faintly. "You've been talking to investors too much." He looked confused. "What?" "Normal people say they have 6 months before they run out of money." "You said runway." He laughed for the first time all day. "Fair point." Then his smile disappeared. "I was going to ask if the trust could help." I appreciated that he said ask, not expect, not assume. Ask. I answered carefully. "I can't." His shoulders dropped slightly. "I figured. The trust isn't my checking account." I know, and Grandma wrote very specific rules. He nodded. I heard. I haven't even been appointed trustee officially yet. I know. He looked out toward the street. I think maybe... He hesitated. Maybe that's for the best. Why? Because if you gave me money today... He shrugged. I'd probably learn nothing. That wasn't the Ryan I'd grown up with. It was the first time I'd heard him separate help from dependence. I can do something else. He looked up. What? I'll review your financial statements. As your sister, as a CPA, you'd really do that. I won't invest. I won't guarantee loans. I won't write checks. But I'll tell you exactly why investors are walking away. He stared at me for a moment. That's probably worth more. I smiled. It usually is. The recess ended 20 minutes later. Everyone returned to the conference room. Richard waited until we were seated. Before we conclude today's proceedings, Eleanor requested that I clarify the purpose of the trust. He opened another folder. This isn't an additional amendment. It's an explanatory memorandum. He adjusted his glasses. Eleanor anticipated misunderstandings. That sounded exactly like Grandma. Richard continued. The trust is designed to preserve assets, provide educational opportunities, assist family members during genuine hardship, and support charitable work. He looked around the room. It is specifically prohibited from funding businesses that have not demonstrated financial accountability. Ryan nodded before anyone else could react. That makes sense. My father looked toward him. You agree with this? Ryan answered quietly. I do. Dad stared. But my company shouldn't survive because Grandma died. The sentence hung in the air. I want it to survive because it's actually worth investing in. Nobody answered. Even my father looked surprised. My mother finally spoke. Ryan? No, Mom. His voice remained respectful, but firm. I've spent my whole life believing everyone else would figure things out for me. He looked toward me. I think Samantha's been figuring things out for all of us. I felt my throat tighten. That single sentence acknowledged something nobody in my family had ever said aloud. Richard continued reviewing the administrative process. Then my mother interrupted. So that's it. What do you mean? We're just supposed to accept this, Richard answered evenly. You're free to seek independent legal advice. Dad looked toward my mother. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Then she looked at Richard. We intend to challenge the amendment. The room fell silent again. Ryan turned sharply. Mom. She ignored him. This isn't what Eleanor really wanted. Richard didn't argue. He simply made another note. I understand. Dad spoke next. We believe our mother was emotionally vulnerable. Richard closed his notebook. Very well. So you're filing a formal objection? Yes. My stomach tightened. Not because I feared losing, because I knew exactly what happened next. Richard looked at both of them. I want to make sure you understand the consequence. Dad answered immediately. We do. Richard shook his head. I don't believe you do. He reached into his briefcase, then removed a sealed evidence bag. Inside was the small digital recorder I'd seen days earlier. My mother went completely pale. Richard placed it gently on the conference table. As required by Eleanor Richardson's written instructions, because a formal challenge has now been entered. The recording of the final family meeting will become evidence. He paused before adding one final sentence. It will be transcribed in full and included in the probate file available to the court. Ryan looked at our parents. Neither of them said a word. Neither reached for the recorder. Neither repeated the accusation that Grandma had been manipulated. For the first time, I wondered what had actually been said during that meeting. And judging by the fear on my parents' faces, whatever Grandma had recorded wasn't going to protect me. It was going to expose them. No one touched the recorder. Richard let the silence do its work. My mother was the first to look away. She folded her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. My father stared at the evidence bag for several long seconds before speaking. "We'd like to consult our attorney." "Of course," Richard replied. "That's your right." He made no attempt to persuade them otherwise. He simply gathered the documents into neat stacks. "The probate court has scheduled a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. If your attorney maintains the objection, the recording and all supporting evidence will be submitted at that time." Dad nodded once. "We understand." The meeting adjourned shortly afterward. No one hugged, no one suggested dinner. The family that had always insisted we stay together at all costs suddenly couldn't leave the building fast enough. 3 weeks later, we met again. This time, it wasn't in Richard's conference room. It was in probate court. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Probate hearings rarely attracted spectators. The judge, a woman in her 60s with decades of experience, reviewed the filings before looking over her glasses. "I understand the objectors allege undue influence and diminished capacity." My parents' attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He was professional and respectful. Unlike television dramas, there were no dramatic speeches. No one pounded tables. He simply explained that Patricia and Michael believed Eleanor had been emotionally influenced during her final months. The judge nodded. "Very well." She turned toward Richard. "Mr. Nolan." Richard stood. "Your Honor, the estate intends to demonstrate that Eleanor Richardson possessed full testamentary capacity, acted independently, and anticipated this exact objection." Hun handed several binders to the court clerk. I recognized them immediately. The same 3 binders I'd seen weeks earlier. Only now they had tabs dividing every section. Medical records, meeting summaries, emails, personal journals, estate planning notes. Richard didn't rush. He began with the simplest evidence: medical evaluations. Eleanor Richardson underwent 2 independent cognitive assessments within the 6 months preceding execution of the amendment. The judge reviewed the reports. Both physicians reached the same conclusion: alert, independent, excellent memory, fully capable of making financial and legal decisions. My parents' attorney read them carefully. He didn't challenge the doctors. There was no basis to. Richard continued. "The amendment itself was executed in accordance with all statutory requirements. Witnesses, notary, attorney supervision. Everything had been done correctly. Again, no objection." Then came the correspondence. Richard distributed copies of Grandma's handwritten journals. The judge spent several quiet minutes reading selected entries. Finally, she looked up. "These notes span many years." "Yes, Your Honor." "They weren't created shortly before her death." "No." "They document long-term observations." "They do." The judge nodded thoughtfully. That seemed important. Not because the journals proved anyone was malicious, because they demonstrated consistency. This wasn't a sudden emotional decision. It had developed over years. Then Richard spoke the sentence everyone had been waiting for. "The estate is prepared to introduce the recording referenced in Eleanor Richardson's amendment." The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Even my parents' attorney looked towards them. Dad swallowed. Mom stared at the table. The judge asked, "Do the objectors wish to proceed?" Their attorney leaned toward them. The three spoke quietly for almost a minute. I couldn't hear a word. Ryan sat beside me without moving. Finally, the attorney stood again. "Your Honor," he paused. "Before the recording is introduced, my clients would like a brief recess." The judge agreed. 10 minutes. Nothing more. Ryan and I waited in the hallway. Neither of us said much. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Do you think they knew Grandma recorded everything?" "I honestly don't know. They look terrified." "They do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "All those years." He hesitated. "I don't think Mom and Dad ever woke up planning to hurt you." I considered that. "I don't think so either." He looked surprised. "You don't?" "No. I think they convinced themselves every decision was temporary." Ryan frowned. "And temporary became normal." "Exactly." He nodded slowly. "I hate that." "So do I." For a long moment, we watched people walking through the courthouse lobby, lawyers carrying briefcases, families waiting for hearings, clerks pushing carts full of files. Life continued around us. Ryan finally asked, "Do you think they'll ever apologize?" I answered honestly, "I don't know. I hope so. I hope so too." But hope and expectation weren't the same thing anymore. Grandma had taught me that. The bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. The judge took her seat. She looked toward my parents' attorney. "Has your position changed?" The attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He took a slow breath. "My clients wish to withdraw their objection." The courtroom fell silent. Richard didn't smile. He simply nodded. The judge looked at Patricia and Michael. "Is that your decision?" Dad answered quietly. "Yes." "You understand that the amendment will remain fully effective?" "Yes." "And that this matter will be concluded today?" "Yes." The judge signed the order. Just like that. The legal battle was over. No recording needed. No public humiliation. No courtroom confrontation. Grandma had prepared the evidence. The possibility of hearing it had been enough. Outside the courtroom, my parents approached me for the first time in weeks. Ryan quietly stepped away to give us space. Mom spoke first. Her voice was softer than I'd heard in years. "Samantha." I waited. "We made mistakes." I said nothing. She continued. "We always thought—" She looked toward my father before finishing. "That you didn't need as much." Dad nodded. "You were independent." "You always figured things out." "You never asked for help." I listened carefully. Those statements weren't false, but they weren't complete either. Finally, I asked, "Did either of you ever wonder why I stopped asking?" Neither answered. I continued. "You assumed I didn't need support." "I stopped asking because I learned the answer before I finished the question." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted you to feel unloved." "I know." She looked surprised. "You do." "I believe you loved me." I paused. But love isn't the same as fairness. Neither argued. For the first time, they didn't defend themselves. Dad spoke quietly. "We honestly believed Ryan needed more." "I know. And we believed you were strong enough." "I know." He lowered his head. I can finally hear how unfair that sounds. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even a complete one. But it was the first time either of my parents had acknowledged the pattern instead of explaining it away. I appreciated that. It didn't erase 30 years, but it mattered. Mom took one cautious step toward me. "I hope, someday." She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence. I answered gently, "I've forgiven you." Both of them looked relieved. Then I continued, "But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was." Their expressions changed again. "I need different boundaries now." Neither objected. Perhaps because for the first time they understood that boundaries weren't punishment. They were protection. As Richard walked out of the courthouse carrying the estate files, he handed me one final envelope. "I almost forgot." I looked at the familiar cream-colored paper. "Another letter." He smiled. "Eleanor asked me to give you this only after everything was over." I turned the envelope over. Across the back in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting were just 9 words. The hardest part wasn't winning. It was finally believing yourself. I didn't open Grandma Eleanor's final letter at the courthouse. That place had been filled with enough endings. I wanted to read her last words somewhere that felt like a beginning. So I drove to the lake house. The same lake house I'd spent years helping her maintain. The same one my parents had quietly assumed would eventually belong to someone else. Late afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water as I unlocked the front door. Everything smelled exactly the way it always had. Old cedar, fresh coffee, the faint scent of the lavender sachets Grandma tucked into every closet. Nothing had changed, except me. I placed the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen table where we'd shared countless breakfasts together. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. Then I carefully unfolded the letter. My dearest Samantha, if you're reading this, then the difficult part is already behind you. Not because the legal work is finished. Because you finally stopped asking other people to decide what your worth is. That is the inheritance I wanted for you. Everything else is paperwork. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. Practical, clear, never sentimental without purpose. I continued reading. I have been thinking for years about what wealth truly means. Money disappears. Property changes hands. Businesses succeed and fail. Character is the only inheritance that grows when it is shared wisely. Please don't use this trust to prove anyone wrong. Use it to prove something better is possible. I paused. That sentence settled into my heart more deeply than anything else she'd written. Grandma had never wanted revenge. She had wanted restoration. Not restoration of our old family dynamic. Restoration of healthy principles, she continued. Ryan deserves the opportunity to become responsible without being rescued. Your parents deserve the opportunity to reflect without being humiliated. And you deserve the opportunity to live without believing your value depends on constant sacrifice. Do not confuse compassion with unlimited access. The healthiest families are built on respect, not obligation. I folded the letter into my lap and looked out at the lake. For years, I had believed being dependable was the same thing as being loved. Now I understood they were completely different. Being dependable had become my identity. Being respected would become my boundary. Over the next 12 months, my life became surprisingly quiet. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, because I stopped volunteering to solve problems that weren't mine. When Mom called asking whether I could reorganize their retirement accounts, just this once, I referred her to an excellent financial planner. When Dad wanted me to review tax documents over a holiday weekend, I recommended a CPA in his town. When extended relatives assumed I would organize every family gathering, I politely declined unless I genuinely wanted to participate. At first, everyone seemed confused. Then something unexpected happened. They adapted. The world didn't collapse because I stopped carrying all of it. Ryan called me regularly, not to ask for money, to ask questions. Can you explain cash flow? Can you look at this budget? Why won't investors accept these projections? Those were conversations I enjoyed. He wasn't asking me to save his company. He was asking me to help him become better at running it. There was a difference. 6 months later, he secured a smaller round of investment. Not because Grandma's trust guaranteed anything, because he'd rebuilt his financial plan from the ground up. When he called to tell me, he laughed. I finally understand why you always asked for documentation. I laughed too. Welcome to adulthood. He paused. I couldn't have done it without your advice. You did the work. For once. Exactly. I was proud of him, not because he'd become successful, because he'd become accountable. The trust officially began operating later that year. Its purpose wasn't to accumulate wealth indefinitely. It was to create opportunities consistent with Grandma's values. After months of planning with Richard and an independent advisory board, we launched the Eleanor Richardson Educational Trust. One of its first initiatives funded scholarships for students whose college plans had been disrupted because their families redirected financial support elsewhere, not because those students had the highest grades, not because they told the saddest stories, because they demonstrated resilience, responsibility, and a clear plan for using the opportunity. Every application was reviewed anonymously. Every decision was documented. Every dollar was accounted for, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. At the dedication ceremony, Richard stood beside me overlooking the small audience gathered at the community foundation. Eleanor would have approved. I smiled. I hope so. He looked at the scholarship plaque. No. I know so, My relationship with my parents changed. It never returned to what it had been, and that was healthy. We had dinner together several times during the following year. The conversations were cautious at first, then gradually more natural. One evening after dessert, Mom quietly handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver photo frame. It held a picture of Grandma Eleanor and me repairing the old dock years earlier. I had never seen the photograph. Mom smiled sadly. Your father took that. I looked at Dad. He nodded. I always liked that picture. I couldn't help asking, why didn't I ever know it existed? He looked down at his coffee. I guess, he sighed. We spent too many years noticing what Ryan needed. We forgot to notice what you were already doing. There was no excuse attached. No explanation, just acknowledgement. For me, that mattered. Not because it erased the past, because it showed they were finally willing to see it honestly. A few weeks before, what would have been Grandma Eleanor's 86th birthday, I returned to the lake house alone. The porch overlooked the water exactly as it always had. I carried her final letter with me, not because I still needed answers, because it reminded me of the life I'd chosen. I placed the letter inside a wooden memory box beside old family photographs and one of Grandpa's pocket watches. Then I locked the box, not to hide the past, to preserve it. Some memories belong in your life, others belong in your history. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I realized something I hadn't expected. For years, I thought justice would feel loud, like winning an argument, like proving everyone wrong. Instead, justice felt quiet. It looked like sleeping peacefully, answering the phone without anxiety, helping only when I freely chose to, building relationships that didn't depend on guilt. Grandma hadn't left me the biggest gift because I had earned it. She left it because she wanted the cycle to end with me, and that was exactly what I intended to do. Life lesson: if you've ever been the dependable child, the responsible sibling, or the family member who was always expected to understand this story may have felt painfully familiar. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from one dramatic betrayal. They come from years of small expectations that quietly teach you your needs matter less than everyone else's. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you love your family less. It means you're finally making room to love yourself with the same respect you've always offered others. Forgiveness can bring peace, but forgiveness does not require restoring unlimited access to your time, your finances, or your emotional energy. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and accountability, not guilt or obligation. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Your perspective may encourage someone else who is struggling to set healthy boundaries. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice, healing, and quiet strength, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.